Greetings, citizens of the world, governments and corporations. We are anonymous.
Why did the United States attack Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen? Why are U.S. operatives helping to destabilize Syria? And why is the United States government so intent on taking down Iran, in spite of the fact that Iran has not attacked any country since 1798? And what's next? What are we headed for? When you look at the current trajectory that we're on, it doesn't make any sense at all if you evaluate it based on what we're taught in school. And it doesn't make any sense if you base your worldview on the propaganda that the mainstream media tries to pass off as news. But it makes perfect sense once you know the real motives of the powers that be. In order to understand those motives, we first have to take a look at history. In 1945, the Bretton Woods Agreement established the dollar as the world reserve currency, which meant that international commodities were priced in dollars. The agreement, which gave the United States a distinct financial advantage, was made under the condition that those dollars would remain redeemable for gold at a consistent rate of $35 per ounce. The United States promised not to print very much money, but this was on the honor system, because the Federal Reserve refused to allow any audits or supervision of its printing presses. In the years leading up to 1970, expenditures in the Vietnam War made it clear to many countries that the U.S. was printing far more money than it had in gold. And in response, they began to ask for their gold back. This, of course, set off a rapid decline in the value of the dollar. The situation climaxed in 1971 when France attempted to withdraw its gold and Nixon refused. On August 15th, he made the following announcement.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
This was obviously not a temporary suspension, as he claimed, but rather a permanent default. And for the rest of the world who had entrusted the United States with their gold, it was outright theft. In 1973, President Nixon asked King Faisal of Saudi Arabia to accept only US dollars as payment for oil and to invest any excess profits in US Treasury bonds, notes, and bills. In return, Nixon offered military protection for Saudi oil fields. The same offer was extended to each of the world's key oil-producing countries, and by 1975, every member of OPEC had agreed to only sell their oil in US dollars. The act of moving the dollar off of gold and tying it to foreign oil instantly forced every oil-importing country in the world to start maintaining a constant supply of Federal Reserve paper. And in order to get that paper, they would have to send real physical goods to America. This was the birth of the petrodollar. Paper went out, everything America needed came in, and the United States got very, very rich as a result. It was the largest financial con in recorded history. The arms race of the Cold War was a game of poker. Military expenditures were the chips, and the US had an endless supply of chips. With the petrodollar under its belt, it was able to raise the stakes higher and higher, outspending every other country on the planet, until eventually US military expenditures surpassed that of all other nations in the world combined. The Soviet Union never had a chance. The collapse of the communist bloc in 1991 removed the last counterbalance to American military might. The United States was now an undisputed superpower with no rival. Many hoped that this would mark the beginning of a new era of peace and stability. Unfortunately, there were those in high places who had other ideas. Within that same year, the US invaded Iraq in the first Gulf War. And after crushing the Iraqi military and destroying their infrastructure, including water purification plants and hospitals, crippling sanctions were imposed which prevented that infrastructure from being rebuilt. These sanctions, which were initiated by Bush Sr. and sustained throughout the entire Clinton administration, lasted for over a decade and were estimated to have killed over 500,000 children. The Clinton administration was fully aware of these figures.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, and that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Miss Albright, what exactly was it that was worth killing 500,000 kids for? In November of 2000, Iraq began selling its oil exclusively in euros. This was a direct attack on the dollar and on U.S. financial dominance, and it wasn't going to be tolerated. In response, the U.S. government, with the assistance of the mainstream media, began to build up a massive propaganda campaign claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and was planning to use them. In 2003, the U.S. invaded, and once they had control of the country, oil sales were immediately switched back to dollars. This is particularly notable due to the fact that switching back to the dollar meant a 15 to 20% loss in revenue due to the euro's higher value. It doesn't make any sense at all unless you take the petrodollar into account.
So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
Let's take a look at the events of the past decade and see if you see a pattern. In Libya, Gaddafi was in the process of organizing a bloc of African countries to create a gold-based currency called the dinar, which they intended to use to replace the dollar in that region. US and NATO forces helped destabilize and topple the Libyan government in 2011, and after taking control of the region, US armed rebels executed Gaddafi in cold blood and immediately set up the Libyan Central Bank. Iran has been actively campaigning to pull oil sales off of the dollar for some time now, and it has recently secured agreements to begin trading its oil in exchange for gold. In response, the US government, with mainstream media assistance, has been attempting to build international support for military strikes on the pretext of preventing Iran from building a nuclear weapon. In the meantime, they established sanctions which US officials openly admit are aimed at causing a collapse of the Iranian economy. Syria is Iran's closest ally, and they are bound by mutual defense agreements. The country is currently in the process of being destabilized with covert assistance from NATO, and though Russia and China have warned the United States not to get involved, the White House has made statements within the past month indicating that they are considering military intervention. It should be clear that military intervention in Syria and Iran isn't being considered. It's a foregone conclusion, just as it was in Iraq and Libya. The US is actively working to create the context which gives them the diplomatic cover to do what they already have planned. The motive for these invasions and covert actions becomes clear when we look at them in their full context and connect the dots. Those who control the United States understand that even if a few countries begin to sell their oil in another currency, it will set off a chain reaction and the dollar will collapse. They understand that there is absolutely nothing else holding up the value of the dollar at this point, and so does the rest of the world. But rather than accepting the fact that the dollar is nearing the end of its lifespan, the powers that be have made a calculated gambit. They have decided to use the brute force of the US military to crush each and every resistant state in the Middle East and Africa. That in itself would be bad enough, but what you need to understand is that this is not going to end with Iran. China and Russia have stated publicly and on no uncertain terms that they will not tolerate an attack on Iran or Syria. Iran is one of their key allies, one of the last independent oil producers in the region, and they understand that if Iran falls, then they will have no way to escape the dollar without going to war. And yet the United States is pushing forward in spite of the warnings. What we are witnessing here is a trajectory that leads straight to the unthinkable. It's a trajectory that was mapped out years ago in full awareness of the human consequences. But who was it that put us on this course? What kind of psychopath is willing to intentionally set off a global conflict that will lead to millions of deaths just to protect the value of a paper currency? It obviously isn't the president. The decision to invade Libya, Syria, and Iran was made long before Obama had risen to the national spotlight. And yet, he's carrying out his duty just like the puppets that preceded him. So who is it that pulls the strings? Often the best answer to questions like this are found by asking another question. Qui bono? Who benefits? Obviously, those who have the power to print the dollar out of thin air have the most to lose if the dollar were to fall. And since 1913, that power has been held by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a private entity owned by a conglomerate of the most powerful banks in the world, and the men who control those banks are the ones who pull the strings. To them, this is just a game. Your life and the lives of those you love are just pawns on their chessboard. And like a spoiled 4-year-old who tips the board onto the floor when they start to lose, the powers that be are willing to start World War III to keep control of the global financial system. Remember that when these wars extend and accelerate. Remember that when your son or your neighbor's son comes back home in a flag-draped coffin. Remember that when they point the finger at the new boogeyman, because the madmen who are running this show will take this as far as you allow them to.
The time is coming when the window for us to restore the control of our government to ourselves will close, and we had damn well better act before then.
You want to know why the American public is fit? They're fit because they're not seeing their Congress do the work that they're sent to do.
We need to demand more of our elected officials.
Damn bills that come out here all the damn time. Come out here in the last second. And I gotta try to figure out how to vote for my people.
Bathed in the excesses of power, they passed a bill that by their own admission, they hadn't read.
This is PR politics.
Unanimous consent that we bring up the bill to extend the tax cut for 160 million Americans. As you walk off the floor, Mr. Speaker, you're walking out.
If you want to stand up on the floor of the Senate and defend the Wall Street banks like Bank of America and the credit card companies, be my guest. I would rather stand with the consumers and retailers who've been taken to the cleaners for years and years.
Why aren't we questioning the underlying premise of the need for a bailout with taxpayers' money? Why aren't we passing new laws that stop the speculation which triggered this? Why aren't we directly helping homeowners with their debt burden? Why aren't we helping American families faced with bankruptcy? Why aren't we reducing debts for Main Street instead of Wall Street? Is this the United States Congress or the board of directors of Goldman Sachs?
When you have a government that operates without limits, which proclaims the right to arrest, torture, and kill anyone, anywhere, with no warrants, no trial, no due process, when you have a government that militarizes the police and grants the armed forces the power to operate with impunity, within your own borders and beyond, a government that views you, the people, as the enemy, and treats you as such, when you have a government that lies to take you into wars of aggression, toppling country after country, killing countless innocent civilians, sending your sons and daughters, your fathers and brothers home in flag-draped coffins, or disfigured and broken in mind and body. Their lives destroyed in wars that serve only to line the pockets of an unelected cartel of bankers and corporations. When you have all of this right in front of you, so blatant, so clear, with president after president towing the line of the same agenda, you shouldn't have to be convinced that both parties in this political puppet show are owned and operated by the same interest. And you shouldn't have to be convinced that these overrated corporate popularity contests that some call elections are distractions that achieve nothing.
These are the steps that we must take.
There are plenty of steps we can take
right now to start getting our economy back on track.
To help create jobs and grow this economy.
If we are going to deal with our dependence on foreign oil,
if we're going to end our dependence on foreign oil,
we'll recruit an army of new teachers.
I want to recruit an army of new teachers.
make college affordable.
Make college more affordable
and repair our crumbling roads and bridges.
We've got crumbling roads and bridges.
Tonight, more Americans are out of work.
We still got friends out there and family who are looking for work.
At a time when so many people are struggling to keep up.
A moment when so many people are still struggling.
If you are willing to work with me,
if you're willing to work even harder in this election,
then I promise you
change will come.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter.
World War III is a loaded term. It assumes that these tragic mass murders that humanity calls war are isolated events with distinct beginnings and ends. This kind of oversimplification obscures the multi-generational chain reactions that lead up to that moment when swords are drawn or missiles fly. Of course, there's another reason that the public is rarely conscious of these chain reactions. The ruling class has learned long ago that the best way to take a nation to war is to trick them into it. Vietnam was an extension of the Cold War, which was an extension of World War II, which was a direct result of the terms imposed on Germany following World War I. This multifaceted conflict which is unfolding right now between the declining powers of the West and the geopolitical and economic upstarts from the East may not end up being labeled as World War III in the history books. Perhaps they'll continue to label each phase with a catchy name like Operation Baltic Freedom or Operation Siberian Storm. Whatever. On the other hand, if someone does something stupid, history books might not make it through the aftermath at all. Of course, I would never insinuate that the US government would do anything stupid. It's not like the country is run by a gaggle of warmongering imbeciles. Well, actually, I suppose that depends on how you define the word imbecile. Congress did just pass Resolution 758 and the Ukraine Freedom Support Act of 2014, which laid the foundation for open and direct conflict between the US and Russia. More sanctions are on the table, and of course, if you've been paying attention, you might have noticed that Washington is playing a game of high-stakes chicken with oil prices, with a little help from our good friends, the Saudis. All the while playing hardball with China in Southeast Asia, and ramping up production of nuclear weapons, while their puppets in Kiev continue to shell civilians in eastern Ukraine. What could possibly go wrong? Heading into 2015, it may have appeared that we were having something of a calm before the storm, but that was an illusion. This war is already hot on multiple fronts. It has been for years. All it takes is one stupid move for proxy wars to cut out the middleman, and then all bets are off. To even consider a direct military confrontation between the US and Russia is insane. Consequences would be nothing short of unthinkable. Yet, humanity seems to be sleepwalking right into that very scenario. Could we as a people stop this? Of course we could. These so-called rulers don't actually have any power. They just have your obedience. Will you withdraw that obedience on time? Or will you continue to allow yourself to be distracted by bread, circuses, and pointless bickering? If you were planning on shifting gears, now would be the time to do it.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall we had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition of, it's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
This is not the Cold War 2.0. This is World War 3.0. The masses may not have figured it out yet, but history will remember it that way. Alliances are solidifying and hot wars are underway on multiple fronts. If the provocations and proxy wars continue, it's only a matter of time before the big players confront each other directly, and that is a recipe for disaster. Does all of this sound insane to you? Oh, you're right. The people running the world right now are insane, and the public is sleepwalking into a tragedy. If you want to alter the course that we are on, there's only one way to do it, We have to wake up that public. Even the most powerful weapons of war are neutralized if you reach the mind of the man behind the trigger. How do we wake the masses, you ask? Don't wait for someone else to answer that for you. Get creative. Act like your children's and grandchildren's futures depend on it, because they do. If this message resonates with you, then spread it. No one wants to believe that their kids are going to live under a military dictatorship. No one wants to see this coming. So most people put their head in the sand and do their best not to think about it. Those who don't always begin with one question. What can we do? The first thing you need to understand here is that our problem is psychological, not material. You have the means to take back your power. And you don't need a set of specific instructions. You don't need someone to hold your hand and explain your role. You don't need someone to give you permission. What you need is to turn off your TV, turn off your radio, put down the iPad, and ask yourself if you're going to be able to look your grandchildren in the eyes and tell them honestly that you did everything in your power to turn this around. Are you going to push this out of your mind because it's uncomfortable, or are you going to convert that discomfort into a driving force? No one can make that choice for you. I'll tell you this much though. If that thought itches in the minds of enough people, we'll figure out a way to scratch it. And if that driven feeling is fully established in your heart, you'll find a way to make it spread.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no secret is revealed.
It is possible to overcome fear when facing real physical danger. And there are some very compelling reasons to learn how. Having the right philosophical scaffolding can help, but in the end, it will always be up to you. Let's begin with a reality check. This planet is and has always been a dangerous place. That adrenaline you feel when standing on the edge of a cliff, or when you realize you almost just stepped on a poisonous snake, or when you finally come to terms with the fact that the government that you live under has become a militarized police state, that feeling is there for a reason. Fear is our physical body recoiling at the prospect of annihilation. Fear is a biochemical alarm system which helps keep organisms alive on this planet by triggering a fight, flight, or freeze response. If the attacker can be defeated, fight. If you can outrun it, run. If you can't beat it or outrun it, freeze and play dead. This alarm system has persisted in the gene pool and will continue to persist because in many life or death situations, it is highly effective. Fear, however, is a double-edged sword. Terror can send a herd of buffalo stampeding over a cliff, and it can make a crowd of humans behave in much the same way. If you need evidence of this, just take a cursory glance at the pages of history, or better yet, take a closer look at current events. Fear doesn't make you smarter. In fact, studies have shown that terror literally shuts down the rational and logical parts of our brains. Now, it's obviously not a good idea to face dangerous situations or to make important decisions with the most useful parts of our brains turned off. But consider the implications of having an entire human society operating at this level. The trouble is, the ruling classes have always understood that it is in their interest to keep the peasants in a perpetual state of fear and insecurity. Those who are able to dictate the nightmares of a nation usually end up dictating everything else. The ability to control our fear and reduce or eliminate its hold on the mind is what allows us to take intelligent action in the face of danger. Having full use of one's brain also helps to distinguish between real and imagined threats. This skill is often referred to as courage. Courage doesn't just happen randomly. A man doesn't just get up one day and perform a triple twisting flip off of a cliff out of the blue. Chances are his heart was pounding like crazy the first time he stood at the edge of a high dive when he was a kid. The primary difference between an expert cliff diver and someone who passes their whole life paralyzed by their fear of heights is that one of them made themselves jump and kept doing so until it became second nature. You might gather from this example that the way to defeat one's fear is to face it. If you're afraid of snakes and you handle them long enough, fear will subside. The same principle applies to most individual fears. Trouble is, fear is like a multi-headed hydra. Cut off one head and another can grow up to take its place. Furthermore, it is often not practical or even possible for us to overcome each little phobia and worry through direct exposure. For example, it would be foolish to attempt to confront one's fear of a dangerous disease like Ebola by contracting it. To overcome fear in a long-term sustainable way, you have to go to the root. But what is the root of fear? The root of all fear, even seemingly petty and insignificant fear, is death. Social anxiety, for example, can be traced to the primal need to be well integrated into one's family and tribe. Being rejected by one's peers was a death sentence in ancient times, and still is today in many societies. This primitive legacy leaves most humans unable to resist the forces of social conformity and authority. Being unconscious of the root makes the irrational byproducts impossible to process. This underlying fear of death is the body of the Hydra. Facing it effectively is the key to freedom. We all live under the shadow of annihilation, whether we consciously acknowledge it or not. You are going to die. I am going to die. In 300 years, every single one of us will be dust. No one leaves this place alive. And there is no getting around that reality, though some convince themselves otherwise. Do you find that thought disturbing? Does it fill you with dread and despair? Whatever you do, don't look away. Hidden within that discomfort is the secret of life. You see, death is the ultimate counselor. It is the ultimate point of reference. Will this thing that you're afraid of right now matter in 300 years? In most cases, you'll find that the answer is no. Regardless of how dire your situation may seem, no matter how serious your personal problems may be, death will erase them all for you someday. Once you fully integrate this reality, you'll find that it's a relief. Just a short internal glance at one's tombstone can be used to release those surface level fears. Take a deep breath, let it go, and do what needs to be done. We are dust in the wind. There is absolutely no sense in poisoning the precious little time that we have with inner turmoil. You're going to die no matter what, so you might as well look your death in the eye and smile like a kid who's been caught with their hand in a cookie jar, and eat that cookie anyway. But what if the answer is yes? What if this issue that's keeping you up at night will matter in 300 years? What should we do then? Well, what would you do about it if you weren't afraid? What would you do if you knew you only had 1 year left to live? Answer that question, and you have found your mission in life. You have found something bigger than yourself, something worth dying for, but more importantly, something worth living for. Are you afraid of walking your path? Then take another look at your grave. Ironically, confronting your death can also help you avoid it. Those who have accepted the inevitable actually have a tactical advantage over those who are terrified of it. Courage is a wild card which can turn the tables against impossible odds. A small group of highly motivated, fearless individuals can accomplish far more than an army of cowardly and obedient sheep. Remember, we can negotiate the timetable to some infinitesimally small degree, but no matter what we do, our lifespans are short like sparks on their one fleeting trajectory of existence. You want to really live? You want to make that spark count? You want it to start a fire before it goes out? Then do not sleepwalk passively towards the gallows. Stand up, look your death in the eye, and dance. Dance like you're never gonna dance again. Sing like you're never gonna sing again. Stand up while your heart is still beating and hold your child in your arms like this moment is all that you have. Because it is.